Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. Well, it's not the Great Erie Canal or the equally important Ohio and Erie Canal. It's just a relatively minuscule 5-mile-long canal, but the Windsor Locks Canal was built unlike any other canal of its era, and it has a great background of political intrigue behind that development. Here to tell us the story is the former First Selectman of Windsor Locks, Chris Kervick. He's author of the book, The Windsor Locks Canal, Yankee Ingenuity and Irish Muscle. Chris is also a professor of local history at Mitchell College in New London. He's going to be along in just a moment with this week's tale. Well, this week's trivia question, the question is, he sometimes hangs hundreds of feet over a large river, makes sure his feet don't slip, and has an open-air office like none other. What is it that Michael D'Onofrio does for a living? Well, stay tuned after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know about next week's show. Well, it's not really a secret, but not too many people realize just how much the cities of Hartford and New Haven really didn't like each other in the past, and some would say the animosity continues amongst some folks, at least, to this very day. The two cities shared the role of capital of Connecticut until 1878, at which point the crown was assumed solely by Hartford. Now, until then, they would take turns holding legislative sessions in one locale one year and the other locale the following year. One thing that always annoyed New Haven was that Hartford was a great city for shipping. It had a good port on the Connecticut River, which gave them access to Long Island Sound and all the distant markets beyond there. Now, most of the produce and manufactured items from the middle of the state and even some parts of Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire came through Hartford. New Haven, you see, didn't have a big river that gave it access to central Connecticut or points north in New England. Yes, they were on Long Island Sound, but they had to build this very long wharf. You may have heard about Long Wharf in New Haven. Well, they had to build that long wharf out into Long Island Sound because New Haven Harbor along the shoreline was too shallow for regular-sized commerce ships. So New Haven decided they were going to build a canal, the Farmington Canal, and it connected New Haven Harbor with Northampton, Massachusetts. They did this after seeing the huge success of the Erie Canal. Well, the action by New Haven created a reaction from Hartford, and the Windsor Locks Canal would soon be a reality. Here to tell us this fascinating story is the former First Selectman of Windsor Locks, Chris Kervick. He's written a book, The Windsor Locks Canal, Yankee Ingenuity and Irish Muscle, a tip of the hat to the roughly 400 immigrant Irishmen who toiled by hand to dig the canal in the early 1800s. Now, Chris, when we talk about the Windsor Locks Canal, obviously it's not the Erie Canal, it's not the Farmington Canal even, it's 5 miles compared to these others, which, the Erie Canal is 360 miles, the Farmington Canal is 80 miles. This was just 5 miles, but there are so many interesting aspects to the Windsor Locks Canal. You've done a book on it, you know all about this, so we're going to jump right into it. What I want to do is, first of all, give people sort of a sense of the rivalry that was going on between New Haven and Hartford and how this played into the building of the Windsor Locks Canal. So New Haven had built this Farmington Canal because it didn't have a river coming from New England down into New Haven like Hartford did. It had the Connecticut River that took it down to Long Island Sound. New Haven didn't have that, so they decided to build this canal because they wanted to tap into the commerce in the middle part of New England, and Hartford didn't like that at all, but they had to get past this pesky Enfield Falls.
To get commerce into the heart of New England, the Connecticut River did the trick. There was a few upriver rapids north of the Connecticut-Massachusetts line, and canals had been built upriver, 4 of them, in Massachusetts and Vermont. But the 5.5-mile stretch of rapids that run from the lower part of what is now Windsor Locks through Suffield, that was an impediment. So the way they worked their way around it is they either waited till there was high water in the spring, but more commonly, the sloops would come up as far as Warehouse Point, and then they would offload their goods into warehouses, thus the name Warehouse Point. They would then transport those overland to Springfield, where they put them back on boats and send them north. Or they would offload the goods into these scows that required men with they call them polesmen. They would need one man per 1,000 pounds of goods, and they would stand on each side of the boat, and they would basically pole it up over the rapids to get past. This was expensive. As a matter of fact, growing up in East Windsor, I'm pretty familiar with their surroundings, and there's several pubs or bars that have been there since ancient times, and this is where the polesmen used to hang out, waiting for the ship to come in, and then captain would say, "Look, I need 4 guys," and off they'd go, and then they'd work their way back after they poled it up over the falls. So this was not an efficient way of getting up the river because the labor costs were much higher than they needed to be because they had to hire these polesmen, or they had to pay for the warehousing and the overland transportation. But there was no other way to get to the heart of New England, so everyone sort of put up with it.
So let me understand this Enfield Falls, because when I first heard about Enfield Falls, I had never heard that the Connecticut River had a falls. And so I started literally on Google Maps and I tried to find it. I couldn't find anything. And so I had to do some other research, find out exactly where it was. It's not a falls like a Niagara Falls. I mean, for anybody who's not familiar with Enfield Falls, I think you referred to it as a rapids. Could you give us a little bit of the history? Is it just a series of rocks? Is it man-made? Is it natural? How would you describe it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I suppose it depends on how you define falls, but rapids might be a more accurate description. It's a series of rapids. Some of the ancient maps, there's Mad Tom Bar and Surf Bar, and these were impediments to navigation where it was very rocky and water was low, especially in the summer months when the water level in the river is, generally at its lowest. But the river does drop 30 feet over that 5.5 mile stretch, creates a rapids condition and creates the impediment to navigation. So it's not a traditional falls where there's a 30-foot drop, over a precipice all in one spot. It happens in a series of rapids over that 5.5 mile stretch.
So these Hartford businessmen, knowing about the success of the Erie Canal and knowing what they're doing in New Haven to build the Farmington Canal, decide they got to get around these Enfield Falls efficiently, and they decide they're going to build their own canal that's going to go off the Connecticut River, come back into the Connecticut River, and bypass these falls.
There was an immediate threat to those businessmen. So then they started to meet about 1824, 1825 to talk about how they were going to not let New Haven beat them. So what they decided was that they were going to one-up New Haven. And the number one thing they were going to do is they were going to bypass the Enfield Rapids, and then they were going to purchase the 4 upriver canals that already existed. They might have to retool them a little bit so that they were consistent in terms of the size of the locks, so certain size boats could pass through all of those locks. But the first thing they did was to construct the Enfield Falls Canal. And it wasn't enough just to make the river navigable past the rapids. They needed to one-up New Haven. So at this point, steamboat traffic was already making its way up to Hartford, but they decided they were going to take that technology and adapt it to the use of canals. So their plan was these didn't exist yet, but to design narrow and very shallow draft steamboats that could tow barges through the canal. Because New Haven was strictly like the Erie Canal. It was designed for horses and mules pulling, boats through the canal. But they were going to beat them by adapting the new technology. The New Haven folks would consider the Enfield Falls Canal really not even be a canal, but a river improvement. New Haven considered itself a true canal. Hartford was taking an existing system and just fixing the kinks.
Now, there's something else while we're talking about the strategy of the Hartford businessmen that I think is interesting. Number one, so you're going to have, I think it was ended up with 5 locks in in the Windsor Locks Canal, and each of those could charge a toll if they wanted to, and depending on what's being carried and whatnot. But they also, if I understand the story right, they bought the land along the canal, and they were selling sites for people to put mills, And the way they constructed the lock gates was so sophisticated, the apertures that open and shut, that they could actually, better than any other canal at that point in time, control the water flow to the point where not only could they sell the sites for mill development, but they could then sell the flow of the river so that people could power their mills, and so they would lease the rights to use that water to power their mills as well. I mean, this sounds like a great idea.
There was always some speculation as to whether or not this was something they discovered after the fact, the potential for the use of water power. But based on the documents that I've uncovered during the preparation of this book, I've been able to show that this was part of the plan right from the get-go. So when they designed the canal, they designed it for a dual purpose: the transportation function to pass the rapids, but also they realized that because on the south end of the canal, what's now the Windsor Locks end, the difference in the water level, the average water level of the river and the water level of the canal was 30 feet. So that all represented potential energy. So on the north end of the canal, you have one lock, which is, they call it the guard lock. It's just the entry lock. It didn't raise or lower boats to any significant degree. But then they constructed, and this is what separates it from most of the other canals of the era. Adjacent to the guard lock, they constructed this big breast wall that had apertures in it, gates in the wall that they could crank up or crank down the gates to really finely control the water level in the canal. They also designed apertures in the sidewall of the canal so that you could lease. They called them water lots. And if you leased a water lot, it came with an aperture. And the size of the opening, depending on how much you paid, determined the size of the opening. If you were leasing one of those openings to power your originally water wheels, eventually it was turbines, you needed the water level to be right to the top of your aperture. Because if it was only halfway up, then you weren't going to get the same amount of water that you paid for. So the canal company knew that they needed to finally control the water level of the canal, which they did by the controlling of the gates and the breast wall, so that there's a reading of what they did each hour in order to keep the water level in the canal constant. So it was a brilliant engineering feat, because in the end, when the transportation function of the canal started to decline, it was the leasing of water rights to these mill sites that really returned the first profit of the canal.
Now, let's talk for a second about actually building the canal. So you're thinking about this, and you go to the beach and you dig a little trough and you let the water come in from the waves, and and you kind of get a sense for what these guys had to do. They basically had to build a 5-mile trench, which, as you say, dropped 30 feet in vertical height along the way. And they didn't have any John Deere or Caterpillar heavy equipment machinery to help them. How did this occur?
If you sort of use as a marker the railroad bridge that crosses from the Windsor Locks side to the East Windsor Enfield side, below that, the canal was excavated out of land. In other words, it was dug from existing land. North of that, it was constructed a completely different way. What is now the west bank of the canal was once the west bank of the river. And they built a levee in the river and ran parallel to what was the west bank of the river. Most of it was done by hand digging, and a lot of it was done by blasting, which was another big problem because they didn't have dynamite back then. So what they did is they spent half a day driving an iron rod into the rock to try and make a place to pack black powder. And they would pack black powder into this hole that they dug in the rock. Then they'd use a rudimentary fuse and run like hell and hope for the best. There's reports on this and other canals where stones the size of pumpkins were landing a quarter mile, half a mile away. So nobody was safe when the blasting took place. They paid a small premium for people who had demolition skills. So therefore, most of the workers claimed that they had demolition skills, but it's not clear that any of them really did.
Wow. Now, like most canals, it was not built to carry passengers per se. It was built for commerce and to carry goods and do it better than horses and wagons could do it up until then. There was one famous passenger who came through in 1842, an author from Great Britain named Charles Dickens. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, he was here doing research on his book that was eventually called American Notes. And he spent the night in Springfield, and it was early in the year. The river hadn't been open for transportation. So he was the first boat to go through that year, which, of course, because he was famous, they made accommodations. And he hopped on one of the steam tugs that had a very small parlor. He commented on how it was, because of its small size, was more fit for a Lilliputian than things he was used to in back in England. These boats had to be small because they had to fit through the canal. So he worked his way down, and many times hitting ice and breaking through ice because it was that early in the year, and went down to Hartford. That was his claim to fame. And there was a daily packet boat, at least daily, between Hartford and Springfield for passenger service during the the first 20 or 30 years of the canal operation. But again, once the trains came in 1844, there was certainly less of the passenger function, a declining of the commercial function as well. Heavy freight such as coal, it was cheaper to transport it by water and through the canal than it was on the trains. And then also one particular product, there's the powder mills at Enfield, Hazard Powder Company. That was considered too dangerous to transport by rails. So almost all the powder that came out of Enfield, by many estimates, like half of the powder used in the Civil War, or at least on the Union side, came out of the Hazardville Powder Company. That went by river and canal because they just didn't feel comfortable, with sparks and jostling around transporting the gunpowder.
Now, there's one great story about commerce on the canal that just has to be told because the Dexter Company is the oldest listed company on the New York Stock Exchange. Tell us about Dexter.
The Dexters came to Windsor Locks pre-canal, and they owned and operated both a sawmill and a grist mill. And then the third Dexter, C.H. Dexter, there was Seth Dexter 1 and then Seth Dexter 2, and then the grandson of the original, he started doing experiments on paper in the basement of the grist mill. He was aided by a guy named William English, who had been an Irish paper maker. He and C.H. Dexter were buddies, and they were young men. They were in late teens, early 20s, and they were learning how to make paper. And then they started making paper in that mill, and eventually they opened up a second mill. They weren't the first paper maker on the canal. They were about the third or fourth, but they were long lasting, and they really had a series of innovative products, including tea bags and the paper that's used to wrap cold cuts and things of that nature. And then they remained, and their products were innovative, and they still there. They finally got bought out in I think the early 90s by a Finnish company named Alstrom, but they're still there, and they're still producing paper. One of the few paper mills left.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History. The Windsor Locks Canal also had a tow path for backup use, and today it offers a gorgeous stroll along the canal on one side and the Connecticut River on the other side. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Chris Kervick. He's author of Windsor Locks Canal, Yankee Ingenuity, and Irish Muscle. He's also former First Selectman of Windsor Locks and professor of local history at Mitchell College in New London. The answer to this week's trivia question: he sometimes hangs hundreds of feet in the air over a large river, makes sure his feet don't slip, and has an open-air office like none other. What is it that Michael D'Onofrio does for a living? Well, the answer is Michael paints the George Washington Bridge, and he performs other nerve-wracking maintenance on one of the largest suspension bridges in the world. Next week on Amazing Tales, for our 200th episode, we'll break the rules a little bit and not focus so much on history as a follow-up to a recent episode on the George Washington Bridge, interviewing somebody who knows precisely what he's talking about with the bridge because he's on it every day. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.